Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. Is Jesus of Nazareth a historically verifiable figure? The historicity of Jesus of Nazareth presents one of the most intriguing epistemological topics in contemporary historiography. One topic which my team and I have decided to address again on this channel, this time examining the sources extensively in the original languages. While his theological significance permeates global religious discourse, our present video will focus on the corpus examining a more secular, historical proposition. What empirical evidence substantiates the existence of a 1st century Jesus, or Yehoshua, specifically in the precise historical context of Roman-occupied Judea? Before we dive deeply into the extant evidence, I would like to spend a couple of words very briefly for maximum transparency and mutual understanding. If you wish to skip these, chapters are available down below. Everyone is welcome in the comments. Christians, atheists, agnostics, or people from other religions, I respect your freedom and thank you for being here. Feel free to share your thoughts down below. No comments will be removed. As a Christian myself, I do have a bias, and I recognize that, but that only affects my desire, not my data analysis. Throughout the research for this video, whether a piece of evidence was valid or not was solely determined by the contextual documented facts available to confirm it. Whether I like it or not is not a factor. Moreover, you can rest assured that this video essay is the effort of a full team, not just my work. And just to mention one, my lead research, for instance, who put a lot of hours into this, is not religious at all. We, as a team, have maintained a common goal to apply guards against selective bias in as much as it is humanly possible, and kept each other in check. We will now reveal all of the historically ascertainable evidence that mentions Jesus Christ. We'll address the concept of contemporary mentions and the idea of independent sources. We will also debunk all those positions pertaining to the Christ myth theory that are not congruent with a correct and professional interpretation of the historical evidence. Likewise, we will call out those positions maintained by apologists that don't fit our chosen methodological framework. We'll dignify any statement made empirically so that hopefully this video will act as a conduit to a more clear, unbiased and coherent presentation. Feel free to pause the video in the next screen to examine the table of contents. Our methodological framework today will be organized the following way. First, we'll have a comprehensive analysis of the sources from both Roman and Jewish historians, writers who had no stake in promoting Christianity and often viewed it with hostility. Second, we'll analyze the contested issue of dating these sources and their independence from Christian influence. Subsequently, we'll undertake a meticulous analysis and critical historiographical consideration to establish the veracity and provenance of ancient testimonials within the ancient Roman imperial apparatus. Finally, we'll evaluate the convergence of the current scholarly consensus, incorporating perspectives from supporters, skeptics, apologists, and mythicists regarding the cumulative weight of the available historical evidence. Convergence in textual analysis and historical reliability presents us with both Christian and non-Christian evidence supporting the existence of Jesus. For the purposes of this video, we will focus on the non-Christian sources, as sources such as the Apostle Paul, the Gospels proper, or any statement made by people who already believe by faith that Jesus is God could be accused of being partial and biased. We do this to establish a basis of intellectual honesty in our research, but regardless of this parameter, we are still left with a plethora of material to work with. I'll substantiate this statement with more details on sections 10 and 11. Let's now define and delineate what sources we have. The non-Christian sources we have as evidence of Jesus' historicity are twofold. They come from Roman and Jewish authors. A dialectical analysis shows that these sources frequently manifest explicit antipathy towards Christianity. If they had a reason to question or doubt the existence of Jesus, the founder of Christianity, it would have benefited them to state it and use it. Yet, no one does. This is a very important contextual clue. Historically, Christianity shook the foundations of Roman theology and pagan worship within the empire, thus alerting the authorities, causing a harsh imperial response towards the new rising religion. That is why this is a fundamental socio-political factor to consider, so keep it in mind as we carefully review the words of the ancients. There are usually two main counter-arguments used to discredit the sources we're about to examine, with the aim of either rejecting them a priori or to at least significantly diminish their historical validity and relevance. One, the question of whether these authors wrote independently of Christian thought or influence, and two, the question of whether or not these sources are contemporary to Jesus' life. So, are these independent sources and are these contemporary sources to Jesus' life? These logical structures are monumental red flags. They are logical fallacies that should not be taken seriously by any historian, scholar or amateur, Christian apologetic or atheist alike, as they operate under a false correlation paradigm. We will address both arguments, counterattack and dismantle them to their very core on sections 10 and 11 respectively. Furthermore, in section 11 I will demonstrate why the evidence we do have for Jesus is in fact exceptional. There are multiple ancient sources that mention Jesus in a variety of ways, degrees of precision and contextual relevance. For this systematic analysis, we will divide these into two categories: dubious sources and certain sources. The first category includes those sources that mention someone that we think could be him, but we are not sure. They could be valid, but they have a lower reliability coefficient. The certain sources are instead those that without question mention him and have a higher degree of verifiability. For our approach to be diachronic, we should begin with possibly the earliest mention or reference to Jesus. Now, this is an indirect one related to a citation by Thallus, a Greek language historian from 52 BC. Thallus is quoted in a fragment of the History of the World by Sextus Iulius Africanus, who wrote instead between the 2nd and 3rd century AD. We read, open quotes, "The most terrible darkness descended over all the earth. The stones were broken by an earthquake, and much of Judea and the rest of the region were disturbed." Thallus, in the 3rd book of the Histories, defines this darkness as a solar eclipse. As for me, this seems inexplicable. Close quotes. According to several patristic scholars, the eclipse reported by Thallus, which another classical author, Phlegon of Tralles, refers to the reign of Tiberius, the second Roman emperor after Octavianus Augustus, and it would coincide with the darkness reported in the Gospels concurrent with Jesus' crucifixion. The testimony, however, while being compelling and evocative, is objectively rather fragmentary from a scholarly perspective, and the fact that Thallus speaks of that episode and its manifestation in Judea doesn't necessarily mean he also cites the figure of Jesus, who in any case is missing from the fragment. So we should probably identify this as more of a support of the idea of the historicity of Jesus by indirectly reinforcing the validity of the Gospels through an external mention of an episode that we do find in the Gospel and we're familiar with. Definitely not a strong piece of evidence, but definitely worth a mention. The testimony of the Stoic philosopher of Syrian origin Bar Serapion, dated by some mythicists to the 2nd century, but more correctly probably dating to 73 AD, is definitely a much more relevant piece of information. It reads as follows. Open quotes. "What advantage did the Athenians gain from killing Socrates? They received famine and death. Or the inhabitants of Samos for burying Pythagoras. In a moment their entire country was covered by sand. Or the Jews for killing their wise king. From that time their kingdom was taken from them." Now, this reference is generally interpreted as to mean Jesus, the wise king. But is it him? Well, there are two reasons as to why this could very well be the case. Now, the first one is something that anyone who is familiar with the Gospels probably immediately thought, which is the idea of what was written on top of the cross of Jesus as reported in the Gospels. So, in re, which is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. In Latin, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum. This would be a strong correlation with the Gospels, but of course, if you don't want to take the Gospels into account, then there is something else, and that is much stronger from a secular standpoint: the word wise. You see, the adjective wise has been used by ancient non-Christian sources to describe him on multiple occasions, not just here, as some mythicists falsely claim. In some cases, this could be done on purpose, but oftentimes I think it's because people just repeat what someone else says, but don't actually spend time in the sources. I will, of course, demonstrate this with actual textual parallelism on section 5. So the next section. However, as it has often been pointed out, we should also spend a couple of words to try and decipher what it actually means when the author says their kingdom was taken from them as a result of killing the wise king. You see, the problem with that is that the kingdom of Judea had been taken from the Jews before Jesus' death, which would create a strange contrast in this. Unless, as a possible different interpretation, Mara was not referring to the initial Roman occupation, but was instead referring broadly to the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The latter would indeed be quite close to him chronologically. Is it really talking about the Roman occupation, or is it talking about the rather disastrous event of the sack of Jerusalem, and creating a link, similarly to the previous statements, with Socrates and Pythagoras as a sort of causal link. You did this, and then this is what happened. If we compare the other events and the level of catastrophic repercussion, which seems to be the theme intended by the author, the latter does appear to fit more neatly. But this, of course, is only speculative. The first undeniable reference outside the Gospel referring to the figure of Jesus is in Jewish antiquities, specifically Jewish Antiquities 1863-64, known among church history scholars as the Testimonium Flavianum. Josephus, a Jewish historian writing around 93-94 AD, mentions Jesus in two passages in his Antiquities of the Jews. One passage, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, has been partially interpolated by later Christian scribes, but many scholars believe that it contains an authentic core describing Jesus as a teacher who was crucified under Pilate, in Latin Pontius Pilatus. The most common translation of the passage reads as follows, open quotes, "At this time there was Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one should call him a man, for he was a doer of extraordinary deeds, a teacher of men, who received the truth with pleasure, and he attracted many Jews and many of the Greeks also. This was the Christ. And when Pilate, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, punished him by crucifixion, those who had first loved him did not cease, for he appeared to them on the third day, living again, the divine prophets having foretold these and thousands of other wonders concerning him. And even now the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out." First, note that I stressed in red the words wise, for obvious reasons, but also the word accusation. Now we will come back to what the word accusation actually means from a Roman legal standpoint, as that will give massive credibility to a passage that is often attacked by mythicists. That is because they haven't studied Roman law. Now this about the accusation is something you may have heard before, so keep watching in order to get a proper, correct interpretation, so that you too will know how to defend it. But let's focus on the first red word, wise. First wise king, now wise man. It is possible that wise was indeed a descriptive term commonly used to refer to him, and you will see that it will come back again. Now the Testimonium Flavianum is valid. However, it's a problematic contribution, and that is because manuscript copies of Jewish antiquities are all from the 11th century or later, and it's practically certain that they underwent interpolation by Christian copyists. In simple terms, Christian monks added Christian concepts into the original core, and these Josephus did not write. Logically, even though this unfortunately takes away from the power and historical weight of this testimony, a solution would be to identify and remove those interpolated sections in order to return the passage to its unaltered origins, rectifying its full validity. But how can we do that? Now, there are several phrases that could be considered to be incriminated. The sentence, if indeed one should call him a man, this was the Christ, the reference to the resurrection. These are evidently the results of Christian thought, and a non-Christian Jew, like Josephus, wouldn't say these things, just as a matter of deductive logic. Now, because of these obviously apocryphal elements, for a long time a current of scholars claimed that the Testimonium Flavianum was a forgery in its entirety, inserted into Jewish antiquities with the intent to strengthen the historicity of Jesus' figure. Now, this is an overreaction, and there is no academic justification whatsoever for such a categorical rejection. Also because, as we said before, no one questioned the historicity of Jesus in period, so there would be no need to try and strengthen his historicity. If anything, they would want to preach his divinity. That makes contextual sense within this period. Now, in reality, even though it's very likely that Josephus' original work was indeed interpolated, as we explained, and that is indeed the position of my team and I, the most probable and honest interpretation is that the original core was authentic. However, this is clearly just a logical connection, and it's not enough to demonstrate that the rest of the testimony is real. But it doesn't matter, because we have something else. You see, the proof of its original core and what it actually said came with the 1971 publication by Professor Shlomo Pines of a different version of the Testimonium, emerging from the Book of the Title, a work in Arabic by Melkite Bishop Agapius, written in the 10th century AD. Agapius, who cites Josephus, reports the same testimonium, but this time it is indeed missing those sections we think were later additions by Christian monks, giving us a fantastic opportunity to spot the differences. So let's do that. Let's read it. Open quotes. "At this time there lived a wise man called Jesus, Jesus, and his conduct was irreproachable, and he was known as a virtuous man. And many among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon their loyalty to him. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Consequently, they believed that he was the Messiah, of whom the prophets had told wonders. Close quotes. In light of Agapius' source, it can be affirmed that the Testimonium Flavianum was present indeed in the original text of Jewish antiquities, albeit in a different form from what has been transmitted to us. The Christian monks, as we were saying, added sections to strengthen the concept of his divinity, but they were not trying to confirm his historicity, which was never in question, whether by Christians, pagans, Jews, or Muslims. No one questioned his historicity in period. The Arabic citation is much closer to what must have been Josephus' original text. Moreover, and this is really the frosting on the cake, it's appropriate to remember that Jesus is mentioned on another passage of Jewish Antiquities 29:1. Now, for context, this passage speaks specifically about the condemnation by stoning by the Sanhedrin, presided by a Sadducean high priest by the name of Ananus, of a certain, open quotes, brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James, close quotes. Clearly, James the Just. The presence of explicit references to Jesus in Jewish antiquities is very important for the study of the historicity of Jesus, as it demonstrates that according to a non-Christian historian who lived in a time very close to the narrated events, Jesus was not a fictional character, but a real historical person. Now, against this, the scholar Alice Wheely is often quoted as the one who demonstrated that there was no prior version of the Testimonium Flavianum, so the one originating in the Arabic text, and supposedly she did this with a deep, careful analysis. But was it careful? How about we review it? Now, to be clear, she doesn't deny that the Arabic and Syriac versions exist. She does say they do, but she denies their authorships in connection with Josephus. She says instead that they were written by Eusebius of Caesarea. Now, this is ultimately incorrect, as I'll demonstrate in a second. But before I do that, I would like to finish fleshing out the point of disagreement before taking it down. Another person who is often mentioned is Paul Hopper, who has done a grammatical analysis of the text, coming to the conclusion that the writing style in the Testimonium Flavianum is in fact different from what is normally used by Josephus. He states that Josephus uses verbs differently, the structure is different, and therefore Josephus did not write the passage, and he agrees with Wheely on the matter. Finally, G.J. Goldberg, who has also examined the passage, argues that it was plagiarized and formed based on the story of a mass contained in the Gospel of Luke. Ken Olson and Louis Feldman also believe that a Christian like Eusebius is the author of the Testimonium Flavianum and not Josephus. So, to summarize, there are 5 authors here, 5 scholars that believe that Josephus was not the original author and that the Testimonium Flavianum is not authentic. And they're all incorrect. First, the points that Olson advances to postulate Eusebius' authorship of the Testimonium Flavianum are fallacious. 1. According to Olson, the phrase wise man present in the Testimonium is characteristic of Eusebius. He uses this to argue that Josephus didn't write the passage, but Eusebius did. And in order to strengthen this, he uses the expression used by Eusebius, open quotes, a magician or sorcerer rather than a wise man, close quotes, to connect it to the usage of the expression wise man. Similarly, Olson treats this phrase in Greek, paradoxical works, which is present in the Testimonium, as evidence once again of Eusebius' contamination, because it recurs in his writings. Now, we have already addressed that wise man as a possible reference to Jesus is present in Mara Bar Serapion, which they completely ignored. Nonetheless, and this is something they will not tell you when they try to debunk the Testimonium Flavianum, the reality is that the expression wise man was absolutely part of Josephus' vocabulary and written expression repertoire. He also uses the term wise man in Jewish Antiquities 10:237, where he speaks of the prophet Daniel. So, the usage of the term wise man, wise king are absolutely coherent with Josephus' writing style and vocabulary choices, as we could see, and it cannot be used to categorically state or postulate the authorship of the Testimonium Flavianum at the hands of Eusebius. To add insult to injury, the exact phrase paradoxical works is used by Josephus to indicate the miracles performed by the prophet Elijah in Jewish Antiquity 348 and 9182. too, thus being attested in this author well before Eusebius of Caesarea, which completely defeats the aforementioned propositions. Cornelius Tacitus, on his Annals, mentions the crucifixion of Christus at the hands of Pontius Pilate. This is considered one of the most important non-Christian references, as Tacitus was a careful historian who was also generally hostile to Christianity. The pertinent excerpt, composed circa 116 AD, demonstrates remarkable historiographical sophistication in its presentation. Its relevancy has been called into question based on the interpolation hypothesis. Now, such notion has no basis whatsoever, and here is why. The figure of Jesus appears in Tacitus' Annals, published between 114 and 120 AD, with its decisively acerbic, pejorative, and unflattering description of Christianity, which certainly cannot suggest a corrupted or interpolated source at the hands of the Christians. If anything, it militates against the possibility of Christian interpolation. Open quotes. The founder of this sect, the Christians, Christ, had suffered the supreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, by order of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Momentarily repressed, the fatal superstition broke out again, not only in Judea, the origins of this evil, but in Rome itself. Close quotes, Tacitus, Annals 1544. So, Tacitus calls Christianity exitiabilis superstitio, a fatal destructive superstition. Moreover, as we could read, it indicates Judea as the originem eius malis, or the origin of its evil. So, the sect from his point of view. And this is when I'm gonna double down on a point that I mentioned earlier on. I once again repeat, and this is pivotal, the historicity of Jesus was not an issue at any time during the first millennium, so there was simply no motivation for an alleged Christian scribe to insert a line in Tacitus' Annals attesting to the bare fact of Christ's existence and execution. Hence, to interpret it that way is a modernist and anachronistic take, and it's one of the reasons why we always have to apply metacognitive analysis and analytical approaches to the study of the ancient sources. Several characteristics make this reference significant for our historical analysis. First, the prosopographical details demonstrate remarkable accuracy. Tacitus correctly identifies the imperial reign. This granular administrative knowledge suggests access to official records rather than mere hearsay or Christian propaganda, which he would have not given any weight to, nor believed anyways. He hated Christians. All of this also points to proficiency in regards of the historian rather than incompetence, as incompetent would the historian be to just repeat hearsay coming from the Christians. All of that without even confirming the accuracy of the statement that someone like Jesus Christ existed. A historian? This is the part where we can identify and delineate correctly the false narrative pushed by mythicists when they say that all of these sources, and the ones we still have to finish, are all not independent sources of Christian thought. Because what that would mean is that all of these professional ancient historians didn't know how to do their jobs, since writing down hearsay is utter incompetence. And even the most basic utilization of Occam razor would guard you against thinking that ancient historians didn't know how to be historians. At that point, I must say that I believe that these historians just repeated Christian hearsay, even though a lot of them had access to actual imperial archives, is a matter of believing it by faith. The evidence does not support such a take. I'll flesh out this point even more on section 10. Tacitus' methodological approach, as evidenced in his other works, particularly the Germania and History, demonstrates an ability to evaluate sources critically. His position as a senior Roman official, consul suffectus and proconsul of Asia, would have given him access to imperial archives and official documentation, such as the, for example, Commentarii Principis or the Acta Senatus. To think that he even needed to just repeat Christian propaganda about the historicity of Jesus is utter nonsense and does not take into account how good ancient historians were at their job. However, for consistency and honesty in our approach, various historiographical caveats warrant consideration. The manuscript tradition is relatively late, with the earliest copy dating to the 11th century, which creates a sort of temporal gap. Still, the passage's authenticity is generally accepted within serious scholarly consensus. And on that note, I would like to now read from Latin scholar Norma Miller about Tacitus' passage, open quotes. If stylistic criteria mean anything at all, the chapter was written either by Tacitus or by a very skillful imitator of his style. The digression of the author, the resumption of the main theme by igitur, the tone of excitiabilis superstitio, as well as the vocabulary and sentence structure, are most plausibly produced by the historian himself and not by a later interpolator. Close quotes. Worth of note also the passage's integration when it comes to the broader narrative about Nero's scapegoating of Christian during the fire of Rome of 64 AD, which also demonstrates organic compositional unity. Open quotes. Therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians, Christianos. Christus, the founder of the name, auctor nominis, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius, by sentence of the procurator, procuratorem Pontius Pilatus, and a pernicious superstition, excitiabilis superstitio, was checked for the moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. Close quotes. Now, there is a considerable body of literature on this short passage in Tacitus, with the vast majority of scholars agreeing that it gives authentic information about the historical Jesus. Mythicists often argue that if the reference in this passage to Christ is genuine, then it would still not be an independent testimony of the existence of historical Jesus, because Tacitus would have heard this from Christians, or it would have been common knowledge at the time. In other words, what they are stating is that the historian Tacitus is now just repeating Christian propaganda. Now, the problem with that is that Cornelius Tacitus is widely regarded as one of the greatest Roman historians by modern scholars. Ask anyone. A claim of incompetence on his end is unfathomable. And I can't believe I have to say this, but you're either one of the greatest historians ever, or you are incompetent writing stuff without even checking it, just because people say it. The two are mutually exclusive. Pliny the Younger, the Roman governor of Bithynia et Pontus, now in modern Turkey, wrote a letter to Roman Emperor Trajan, or Trajanus, in 112 AD, and asked for counsel on dealing with the early Christians. Now let's review together this very interesting piece of administrative evidence. Open quotes. It is my custom, sir, to refer to you in all cases where I do not feel sure for who can better direct my doubts or inform my ignorance. I have never been present at any legal examination of the Christians, and I do not know therefore what are the usual penalties passed upon them, or the limits of those penalties, or how searching and inquiry should be made. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians and called upon the gods in the usual formula, reciting the words after me, those who suffered incense and wine before your image, which I had given orders to be brought forward for this purpose, together with the statues of the deities, all such I consider should be discharged, especially as they cursed the name of Christ, which, it is said, those who are really Christians cannot be induced to do. Important part. But they declared that the sum of their guilt or their error only amounted to this, that on a stated day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god. Close quotes. Now, apart from the fact that I personally find this very intriguing because it tells us how early Christians met, so the meetings of early Christianity. But apart from that, there is a mention of Christ, and then he says, as though he were a god. Now, once again, this is an official, this is a governor, a professional, and he's writing a letter to the emperor, and he's just repeating hearsay from the Christians? Not to mention, I actually find it interesting that he says, as though he were a god, which kind of underlines the fact that, yeah, he doesn't believe that Jesus was a god, but he doesn't have a problem thinking that he's a man, or that he existed historically. He doesn't question that. Lucian of Samosata, an important Hellenized Syrian satirist, rhetorician, and also a valid source in this discussion. Let's read this passage first and then we discuss it. Open quotes. Those poor people have convinced themselves that they are completely mortal and will live for the eternity. Therefore, they despise death, and most surrender themselves willingly. Moreover, their first legislator convinced them that they are all brothers to one another, after they abandoned the Greek gods, having transgressed all at once, and they worship that same crucified sophist and live according to his laws. Close quotes. This is once again one of those testimonies that mythicists attack by saying, oh, he probably was just repeating the words of Christians. But now the layers of historians and ancient people and writers that keep mentioning Christ but allegedly are not doing any source checking keeps piling up, and we are literally getting to a conspiracy theory level. Next. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus was a Roman historian who wrote during the early imperial era. Suetonius is famous because he mentions a certain Chrestus, spelled with an E. He does so via Tacitus. Now, is this Christos the same as Christos, so Christ? Or is it a different person? Now, this is a little bit of a debated instance. We have already, however, seen that in the sources we have an alternative spelling of either Christianos or Christianos. We're already run into one of those. Therefore, it isn't a massive logical leap to think that if Christianos, Christians, can be spelled Christianos with an E, that perhaps Christos, spelled with an I, could also be spelled Christos with an E and still mean the same person. But of course, we need a bit more than that. For context, Suetonius speaks of events relating to Claudius' reign, so Emperor Claudius, and mythicists usually attack this from two angles. First, the different spelling angle, summarized as he said Christos, not Christos, so different person. This is very easily debunkable, as there are other references to this alternative spelling in the sources, a moot point. The second line of attack is that by saying instigator, he couldn't possibly mean Christ, since 1, he was not an instigator, he was a preacher, and 2, at the time of Claudius, Jesus certainly couldn't instigate anyone anymore. This is also incorrect, but it requires a bit more of a sophisticated analysis of Roman law. But let's do one thing at a time. So, is Christus an alternative spelling of Christos? Yes, it's very plausible. In Tertullian, Christiani is indeed used instead of Christiani, with an E, and he absolutely means Christians, no questions about that. Now, to be fair and give you all the sides and all the possible data, it is important to underline that the name Christos in Greek was rather common among slaves, kind of meant useful, serviceable. For example, one of Cicero's freedmen was named Christos, with an E. And this is one of the points the mythicists used to say that possibly could have been a reference to a slave uprising of Judaic slaves. Still, by using Occam's razor, we'll see that it's indeed much more probable that this does mean Christos, so Christ, and it's just an alternative spelling. You see, in his work, Life of the Roman Emperor Claudius, Suetonius mentions that Claudius expelled Jews from Rome, an event that most scholars date to the year 49 AD, and that Luke mentions in passing in his account about Paul in Corinth, Act 18:2. We read, open quotes, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, in Latin impulsore Christo, he, Claudius, expelled them from Rome. Close quotes. Now, once again, mythicists argue that Tacitus was referring to the followers of a Jewish zealot by the name of Christus, not the followers of Jesus Christ, and that the copyist responsible for the interpolation in Tacitus clumsily inserted the reference to Christus, ignoring the discrepancy between the forms Christus and Christianos. Thus, the interpretation of Tacitus' statement has become somewhat intertwined with the interpretation of Suetonius' statement. Now, the key to unraveling this is the fact that there are absolutely other examples of the use of the spelling Christos and Christianos in reference to Christ and Christians. For example, in a group of 9 tombstone epigraphs in North Phrygia, in modern-day Turkey, the Greek word for Christians is spelled Christianos, Kreistianos, and Kreistianos, the last of which corresponds precisely to Tacitus' spelling. In at least one of these inscriptions, the name is spelled in 2 different ways, Christianoi, Kreistianois. Moreover, the Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th century Christian edition of the Greek Bible, spells the word Christianos in 3 occurrences in the New Testament, Acts 11:26, 26:8, and 1 Peter 4:16. G.H.R. Horsley, in his important discussion of these inscriptions, points out, open quotes, the linguistic fact that there is a nearly complete overlapping of the sounds represented by the following symbols in Koine. close quotes. And there are several studies that prove this point linguistically. The ease, which we have just documented and proven in the Roman world, by which the words Christianos in place of Christianos were used, both in spelling and most likely in spoken word, suggests that Suetonius would have done exactly the same thing, which we have proof for, when he spoke about Christos and connected into Christianos. On the contrary, and this is really the crux of the matter here, we have no evidence, independent of Suetonius' passage, that a alleged Jewish revolutionary by the name of Christos existed in the middle of the 1st century. And do note that whenever there is an actual uprising, a riot, a rebellion, the authorities do let us know and absolutely write it down, because they destroy them, they block them, and they want everyone to see that. If you're familiar with Roman sources, you know this. And the most important aspect of all this is the following. There is a lot more evidence of the existence of Christ, and yet mythicists deny that. But they are quick to accept as real the figure of this alleged Christus, the Jewish rebel, for which we only have one fragmentary mention. A massive double standard. If you question the validity of Jesus' historicity, then even more so should you question the validity of this supposed or alleged Jewish rebel Christos. But they don't, because it serves their purpose. A clear example of intellectual dishonesty. There is a very interesting point from Bart Denton Ehrman, who is now agnostic, so clearly not a Christian apologist. However, he still doesn't question the historicity of Jesus because of this. Open quotes. There are at least 15 different historical sources that attest to Christ's crucifixion within 100 years of his death, between 30 AD and 130 AD. In total, we have 42 sources dating to less than 150 years after Jesus' death that mention his existence, 9 of which are non-Christian. In comparison, regarding Julius Caesar or Julius Caesar, only 5 sources report his military operations. Close quotes. The Jesus mythicists would have us believe that Jesus Christ did not exist and that all these sources are just Christian propaganda, yet, as Miller correctly observes, open quotes, that there existed simultaneously Jewish zealots known as Christiani is to stretch coincidence rather far. Close quotes. Okay, let's debunk properly this concept of independent sources. A main point used against these sources is that they are not independent sources. By independent, they mean independent from the gospel and Christian thought, possible thought contamination. In other words, the author in questions heard that Jesus Christ existed from the Christians, or it was common knowledge at the time due to Christian propaganda. This therefore renders the sources not independent. This approach fails to take into consideration the modus operandi of ancient historians, and it is therefore flawed. This is the basis upon which the likes of Robert van Voorst and R.T. France say that Tacitus is not an independent source from Christians. Now here is why this is a non-scientific and non-academic conspiracy theory. Like all conspiracy theories, the requirement for this to be true necessitates that all these historians and ancient writers, regardless of their value, skill, professionalism, would have all just repeated hearsay without questioning it, without methodically analyzing and confirming that Jesus actually existed. Not only that, but they also would have chosen to commit this piece of information, once again hearsay, into their life's work. All of them, in unison, regardless of culture, background, language, religion, social position, funding, political research, access to imperial sources. So to reiterate the absurdity of the statement and the position, mythicists believe not that just one of the historians was incompetent, already particularly difficult to prove, but all of these sources, all of them, every single one of these otherwise exceptional writers, we constantly read value for their work, contributions on this one thing, failed miserably to do their job, and we are to believe they all just repeated hearsay, deliberately choosing once again to commit it to the records and their highly valued historical work. Absurd. But let's go deeper. Correlation does not imply causation. What this means that even if we were to accept that the sources, all of them, are not independent from Christian thought, that wouldn't prove that Jesus didn't exist historically. Just because two things happen together or show similar patterns, it doesn't mean that one causes the other, or that they are meaningfully related. No, the reality is the following. We have pagan authors who say that Christianity is an abject cult. We have even a pagan philosopher, Celsus, who sets out to dismantle the foundations of Christianity in the 2nd century AD, writing in his True Discourse. Let's read him. Open quotes. You, he's talking about Jesus, invented being born of a virgin. You were born in a village in Judea to a local woman, a poor day laborer who spun thread. She was driven out by her husband, a carpenter by trade, for proven adultery, repudiated by her husband and reduced to ignominious wandering. She secretly gave birth to you from a soldier named Pantera. Because of your poverty, you worked as a hired hand in Egypt, where you became skilled in certain powers which the Egyptians pride themselves on. Then you returned, and emboldened by these powers, because of them, you proclaimed yourself Son of God. You bound to yourself 10 or 11 discredited men, tax collectors, and the most wretched sailors, and together with these you hide, now here, now there, procuring your food in a shameful way, and amid countless difficulties. Close quotes. As we can see by reading this passage, those who oppose Christianity in period, they discredit it, they attack it, and those who want to question its structure go as far as to say that Jesus was an illegitimate son of a soldier and using magician tricks learnt in Egypt, but no one questions his existence. Not even this man tries to do that, and that's indicative. In light of this fact, it's unthinkable that they would have not used the possibility of him not actually existing to try and dismantle Christianity if they had any reason to doubt his historical existence, just once again as a matter of deductive logic. Occam razor. Moreover, the Jews don't question Christ's existence. This point is crucial, because if there had been the slightest doubt about his existence historically, they wouldn't have failed to make it known. As Pascal said, open quotes, the Jews are irreproachable witnesses, but all specialists agree on Jesus' historicity, close quotes. Remember, the correct question in this context is, what reasons do we have to doubt the sources we have about him? Identifying the correct placement of the burden of proof is another fundamental aspect of this whole discussion, and I'm adamant about it. Now, if I say Jesus existed historically, and you tell me, no, I don't think he existed, then the burden of proof is on me. I'm the one making the statement. So if I try and do what some Christian apologists do, which is wrong, and I try to flip the burden of proof onto the person stating that Jesus didn't exist, then I'm not being coherent at that point. I'm the one making the claim Jesus existed historically, and therefore I'm the one who has the burden of proof. And the way you approach that is we do what we're doing on this video. We review the evidence and discuss its validity. However, the same concept applies to mythicists. If we are reviewing the evidence and you state that the evidence in question is not independent from Christian thought, now the burden of proof is on you making such claim. And having reviewed all of the evidence that has been brought forth in order to strengthen this idea that the sources are not independent from Christian thought, it is quite clear that the evidence is inconsequential and inconclusive. The idea of questioning Jesus' historicity and considering it as either Christian propaganda or some sort of construct created by Christians without any foundation of history is a modern concept. It is a modern approach. It is shaped around the idea that now we know how to do history, but ancient historians didn't. The reality is that it is instead very likely that being so close to his existence, more evidence and continuous generational memory was so strong that no one thought it possible to even question it at the time. Hence, whoever wanted to try and attack Christianity decided to instead attack the declaration of his divinity, it being a matter of faith rather than historical evidence. And that's why, when facing real professional academic scrutiny, the idea of these sources not being independent from Christian thought simply because they existed within a time span that included Christians in the question is, as we were saying, flawed. Now let's talk about this idea of, but what about the fact that we have no evidence that is contemporary to his life? One of the most commonly used arguments against the idea of a historically proven Jesus is the notion that unless the sources are contemporary from people writing while he was still alive, then the evidence is not valuable, and this is due to the chronological distance between the events described. This is another massive logical fallacy, and on top of that, one that denotes a strong unfamiliarity with the historical context and the natural expectations of the disciplines of historiography, cultural contextual analysis, and data fragmentation synopsis. To prove this, we have to consider the socio-political visibility in the Roman imperial system of people belonging to the exact same social class as Jesus. Now, it's already staggering that we have what we have, and it's a massive indicator to the exceptionality of Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure. Almost no one from the low classes gets mentioned in the sources. Where are all the historical detailed discussion of John the farmer from England in 1245 living on the rural end of a small backwater village? Unless you're a noble, a king, a politician, a philosopher, a general, a warmonger. History ignores you. You are invisible to the sources. The people that somehow expect to there be contemporary evidence about Jesus in the sources don't take into consideration the following. Jesus was for his first 30 years completely invisible to Roman authors and historiography. To expect the Romans to be telling us about him is shocking. Why? Well, even as a preacher, Jesus only operated for the last 3 years of his life, so his first 30 years completely invisible. As a preacher, he of course was successful. But again, how common were preachers at the time in this specific region? Why do you expect Roman authorities to mention him during his life? It is only natural that all the memories we have about Christ come from after his death. That's when it became noticeable to the Roman authorities. They saw Christianity as a menace to their power and their religious practices, and they were right, as the Roman Empire will eventually be taken over and convert to Christianity, effectively banning all pagan gods and their worship. Let me prove this to you by reading the sources once again. The sources tell us that by 112 AD, Christianity had already penetrated well beyond the borders of Rome into many provinces, south and east of Italy. Pagan temples had been deserted, and large towns and villages, including rural districts, had quite a lot of Christian converts. Let's read. This is Pliny the Younger again, writing to Emperor Trajan. Open quotes. The matter seems to me worthy of your consideration, especially as there are so many people involved in the danger. Many persons of all ages and of both sexes alike are being brought into the peril of their lives by their accusers, and the process will go on, for the contagion of this superstition, Christianity, has spread not only through the free cities, but into the villages and the rural districts, and yet it seems to me that it can be checked and set right. It is beyond doubt that the temples, which have been almost deserted, are beginning again to be thronged with worshippers, that the sacred rites, which have for a long time been allowed to lapse, are now being renewed, and that the good for the sacrificial victim is once more finding a sale, whereas, up to recently, a buyer was hardly to be found. From this, it is easy to infer that vast numbers of people might be reclaimed if only they were given an opportunity of repentance. The debate surrounding the historical existence of Jesus often centers on a fundamental misconception regarding ancient documentary evidence. Critics frequently emphasize the absence of contemporary sources mentioning Jesus during his lifetime, presenting this as evidence against his historicity. However, this position reflects a profound misunderstanding of both ancient documentary practices and the socio-historical context of 1st century Judea. To understand the documentation of Jesus' existence, we must first examine the nature of ancient historiography. Ancient historical sources predominantly focus on individuals who wielded significant political, military, or administrative power, while the social status of Jesus during his lifetime provided crucial context for its documentary silence. He was invisible to Roman authorities. If anything, the eventual documentation of Jesus by historians like Tacitus and Josephus is, in many ways, extraordinary, given his humble origins. This is proof of the remarkable impact of his words after his death. From a historiographical standpoint, once you take into consideration all of this, Jesus' documentation is not only adequate, but surprisingly robust. Now let's return briefly to our question. What does accusation mean from a legal perspective? Jesus was crucified. Now we can't just say, well, Jesus was crucified just because. No, there is a specific reason as to why people get crucified in the Roman world, and that in fact, within Roman law, is divided between times of war and times of peace.
There were a wide range of offences that were punishable by crucifixion according to Roman law. During times of peace, those who inflicted the penalty acted within the constraints of the rule of law, together with the pressure of the political circumstances. During wartime, crucifixion could be used and was used en masse, sometimes in a particularly brutal way. Look at Spartacus's rebellion. 6,000 survivors of the revolt, captured by the legions of Crassus, were crucified, lining the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. Now let me show you what that actually means on a map of Italy. The Appian Way is one of the earliest and strategically most important Roman roads of the ancient Republic. It connected Rome to Brundisium, modern-day Brindisi, in southeast Italy. In Roman orderings of crucifixion during peacetime, however, the situation was different. Consideration was usually given to culpability, and a basic hearing was often given. So what were the crimes? Banditry, murder, treason and sedition, defamation of the emperor, military desertion and cowardice, rebellion, provincial resistance and revolt, civil war, membership in a despised religious group. Within the Roman world, banditry generally has to do with either murder or kidnapping. Bandits are also named in Latin latrones, which is different from the common thieves, praedones. So you would be considered a bandit depending on the violence of your crimes, including murder, the magnitude of your robberies, and the gathering of a band around you. Provincial governors were thus ordered to hunt bandits down for the sake of public order and crucify them. Treason and sedition are relatively similar, but in general can be understood as crimes against the people and state of Rome. And by the times of Augustus, defamatory speech or anything written against the imperial family would be considered treason, and therefore, to the cross we go.
Given Pontius Pilate did say that he found no guilt in this man, but after he decided to wash his hands, he still needed to justify legally the execution, specifically by crucifixion, of Jesus. Now, we know, of course, that Jesus didn't murder anyone, he didn't speak against the imperial family, so how can they pin crucifixion to this man? Well, the only way, legally, from a Roman perspective, that this could be even close to being justified would be the following. He had a gathering of men around him, so they pinned the accusation of rebellion against him as an instigator, which was false, of course. Now, do remember that we know that at least some of the apostles were carrying weapons, specifically bladed weapons. We see this during the arrest of Jesus and a certain sword that is used to defend him, but also in the passage when Jesus instructs the apostles to sell some mantles and use the money to buy some swords, most likely for personal defense. This could be a point used by his opponents, their opponents, to point it towards Roman, to point it as a fake proof of a possible instigation or rebellion or preparation thereof. We now fast forward to the crucifixion itself, and as you know, Jesus is not alone in the Golgotha, and with him there are two men. Now, usually these two men are considered to be thieves or perhaps robbers, but once again, through the lenses of correct literal interpretation of the original text, we may find out more about who these two men actually were. Depending on which of the Gospels you read, these two men are either described as robbers or, in the case of Luke, as criminals. Criminals not to be intended as an insult, but as a descriptive term of someone who has committed a crime, in this case against Roman authority. So let's focus on Luke for a moment. Two others who were criminals were led away to put to death with him. So if you read it in English, the feeling you get is these two have committed a crime, they are criminals, but from Roman perspective, he isn't. Well, let's jump into interlinear Greek again. Were being led away now also other criminals, two with him to be put to death. So to make it make sense within English syntax, were being led away now also two other criminals with him to be put to death. In the original language, the connection of also, other, and then two actually brings forth a different perspective. Imagine it this way. If I told you, this morning I was at Starbucks with two YouTubers, this sentence doesn't tell you anything about what I do. But if the sentence was, this morning I was at Starbucks with two other YouTubers, what's my job? Of course, this doesn't mean that Jesus was a revolutionary. It just means that from the perspective of the authorities, it is very likely that he was condemned with the accusation of sedition. The historical evidence for Jesus must be evaluated within its proper socio-historical context. When viewed through this lens, the patterns of documentation, from initial silence to later historical attestation, align perfectly with what we would expect from a figure who transformed socially from obscure to founder of a significant religious movement. The demand for contemporary documentation represents a historical expectation that fails to appreciate both the nature of ancient historical records and the social realities of first century Roman Empire. Alright, noble ones, but I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember, thumbs up and share it. Share it with all those who ask this question. While making this video, we have simultaneously prepared an other script that will focus specifically on the historical context of Roman Judea, specifically in the time of Jesus, in order to give you the economic standing, the life of the regular people, how taxation influenced the overall morale of several population clusters, all of this to give you even more context when it comes to understanding the life of Jesus in the first century. That video will drop next week, so stay tuned. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.